Amazing. So, as a church, we're looking at this concept of hope in lament. And last week we read from Isaiah chapter 9, and today we're carrying on with that very famous verse. So I think it's rare to be able to get through Christmas without hearing it. Louise is going to come and read to us.
So this reading is from Isaiah chapter 9, and this is verses 2 and verses 6. The people who walk in darkness will see a great light. For those who live in a land of deep darkness, a light will shine. For a child is born to us, a son is given to us. The government will rest on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace.
Fabulous, thank you very much. We'll leave it there, that's fine. Okay, so last week we took a bit of time just looking at and just identifying and saying, like, listen, actually for some people at the moment, life's not brilliant. Some of us in our midst, life is not brilliant. If you're struggling with health issues, when it comes to Christmas, like actually there's a sense of grief that comes with it. If you are somebody who's like struggling financially the rest of the year, you get to December where you're suddenly supposed to find all the extra money to be able to make that work. If you've got kids, and again there's that incredible pressure from the world around to be able to compete with the people that are next to you, and that's really difficult. Like how do we as parents be able to manage this? For some of us, we've lost family members. And so actually, again, Christmas is a reminder that the people that I love and wish to be with are not with me now. For some of you, live in broken relationships. And again, that it's a reminder that actually Christmas is a time when you should be together, where there should be wholeness of family. And through the circumstances of your life, that's not possible. There's so many areas. And we just want to be able to say as a church that we recognize that life isn't always easy. And we want to be able to say that so that we can just say, hey, let's have a pity party, everybody. But it's quite the opposite. It's for us to say, listen, we understand that there is hurt and pain in the world around us. We understand that there is hurt and pain in our own community. And we're saying that as a church, because we're a community, which is a group of people who stand together in unity, with Jesus at the center, this is who we are as a church, is that we're recognizing that actually there is hurt in our midst, and we're saying we're standing together. So for those of you who actually, this time of year is a time of wonder, excitement, and joy, you're able to celebrate that. And for those of you where it's difficult, actually, it's okay for you to be where you are. But there is a greater narrative at work in our midst. And that's why we're taking a time to look at the candles. Not because there's anything mystical or magical or special about the candles, but the candles are there to remind us that there is something greater in our midst. So we started off last week by looking at hope. And recognizing that actually hope is something that we need to be able to get us through dark times. Otherwise, the darkness overwhelms us and we feel like the narrative of our life is despair. Yet when we recognize that there is something greater to come, then we begin to place our hope in the fact that this is merely a season. This is merely a season. And I think I need for us to know this. Now listen, if you're later on in life and actually your body isn't doing what it used to do, and that actually you're struggling, so the day-to-day getting up, getting dressed, all the other bits and pieces is difficult, that to know that because of what Jesus has done and the promise to what is yet to come, there is a beauty in the fact that yes, this is difficult. But there is a season yet to come when Jesus will return and I will be with him in glory, and I will be in a body that is not a problem. I'm going to have a place. I'm going to be inhabiting a place where there is joy and wonder. And sometimes that's useful for us to know, and acknowledge that. So maybe the hope that we're looking to might not necessarily come in our living time here, but there is something greater yet to come. For those of us who are struggling at the moment financially, there's a possibility that we may find ourselves in a better place. So there is an aspect of, we could just say, well, maybe this is just a season. Maybe I'm struggling health-wise at the moment. Maybe this is just a season. But to know and acknowledge there is a greater hope that we are working towards. This is something which is needed for us. So, we looked last week at the idea of hope. Today we're looking at peace. I've asked, as you do, like when unsure what the definition of anything is, we ask the internet. And so I've done just that. So on the screen, we're looking at the Merriam-Webster, and I've asked, what is peace? And so I've got a few different definitions according to the Merriam-Webster's website that explains. So, peace is a state of tranquility or quiet, such as a freedom from a civil disturbance. It is a state of security or order within a community provided for by law. So do those two definitions, they make sense? So your first one is obviously stating that there's a sense of quiet. So we're no longer in war, so we are now in a time of peace. So that's one definition of peace. The next one is freedom from disquieting or oppressive thoughts or emotions. I think that one is something, especially when we're talking about living in a day and age where mental health is very much an in thing to be able to talk about. And when we acknowledge, and again, that within our midst that there are those who struggle with anxiety and depression, the concept of peace being something that is freedom from disquieting or oppressive thoughts and emotions, that for me grabs hold of my attention, and I think to myself, if that's the definition of peace, yes, I don't want to be in a war-struck country, but this one seems to reside a little bit more with me. The next definition, harmony in personal relations. How many of us want that? I mean, that's the concept of peace. And if you're living in a relationship where actually that's not the case, then that's something that we would say actually we want or we long for. And dare I say it, if we have children, there's times when we're praying for that even in the day-to-day midst of our own family lives. Am I allowed to say that? Yeah, of course I am. Next definition, 4. A state of period of mutual concord between governments, or a pact or an agreement, very similar to number 1, but instead of it being peace, but he's actually saying with another, we've come to peace, we have a peace understanding or an accord between different countries. Cool. And number 5 is used interjectionally to ask for silence or calm, or as a greeting or farewell. Now, I would argue that in church we also have something called the peace, which is, if you've grown up in church, we don't do it so much here, but there is actually within Scripture a call to greet one another with a holy kiss, or to share the peace, which would be for us to embrace one another, or sometimes there's liturgy that we would say within that. But that sense of peace could be that. It could be peace go with you. Sometimes you hear that, especially in older English, that kind of like sense of that. Or if it's really loud and you're wanting some peace and quiet, there's the other usage of the word peace. Okay, thank you, Luke. So that was kind of useful, because as we're looking at peace, I don't know about you, but actually peace is something that I don't get that much of. Started off by explaining that actually as a culture, we're a loud culture. And if you walk past teenagers and you see silence, you'll probably notice they've got headphones in and that they're listening to something on their headphones. That actually it's rare for us to have silence. It's rare. I've got to a point in life, I think I must be getting old, where I don't even put music on in my car. I seem to be just driving around like a real old man. Is anybody else with me on that? No? I've spent my whole life blasting music, but I found myself a little bit less of that. I think it's maybe just this kind of recognizing that I need to have moments of silence in my own life. And I don't know about you, but going back to that second definition of peace, I can be in a silent place, yet my thoughts are deafening. Anybody else know that feeling? Yeah, so, like, I might be quiet, but my goodness, internally, it's so loud. And I think that there's an aspect of that I recognize as well. I've often said that I'm not the first person to fall asleep. Nick climbs into bed and is gently purring, we call it that, don't we, beside me, sleeping beautifully, and I'm laid there looking at the ceiling for the best part of an hour. And I'm the sort of person who tends to just naturally reflect. And if I'm not careful, if I don't catch my thoughts, it can be that actually I find myself just spiraling over things I wished I'd said differently in my past, actions I wished I'd done differently. And I know that some of you recognize that. And we can find ourselves in this place where actually our thoughts themselves are deafening. Now, in that Bible verse that we looked at to start off with, Jesus is given a title called the Prince of Peace. Now, if you were with us last week, we took a bit of a brief moment to look at the state of being of the Jewish nation when Jesus arrives on the scene. So just a quick recap is that Israel is in a place where its overlords is the Roman Empire. So they've kind of lost a lot of their own identity. They're swallowed by a much larger, more violent nation, and they are very much under the thumb. The Jewish people, should they do or say anything wrong, then the Roman Empire would make a big thing about publicly disgracing that person. And the way that they would go about doing that would be that they would hang them on a cross outside the busiest gate coming in and out of the city, and they would be stripped naked and shown as a statement. If you mess with the Roman Empire, this is what you get. And so this is just a fact of the way that they dealt with this. And so when we look at Jesus being crucified, it very much fits with that narrative. And yet this is something that was a regular basis. Now, why am I saying this? I'm saying this because actually the people of the Jewish nation, they know their scriptures. And they know that there is promise upon promise upon promise in the Old Testament, or their religious scriptures, that states that the Messiah is coming. And they're longing for the Messiah to come and to bring peace, but not to be a peaceful person. They're expecting that their Messiah is going to come riding on a stallion, gathering the troops of the Israeli nation together to revolt, to kick out the Roman Empire, and to establish the kingdom of old. And there's this real sense that that's what they're waiting for. And they're expecting that their Messiah would probably be born into some area of royalty, or that there'd be something that would cause them to stir. Now, when God's plan comes into action, we know that that's not what happens. Because Jesus wasn't born into a temple, or he wasn't born into a glittering palace. But instead, he was born into a stable where those attending are the animals. Like, we've got this sense, this is something we need to grab, is that this is not how I would have written the rescue plan of my people. Yet Jesus, knowing what he's doing, comes in that fashion. And he walks around with this sense of the Prince of Peace. And this title is not something that I imagine that the people of Israel would have wanted or longed for, yet this is what we see. So for those who are longing for peace, actually the idea that Jesus is the title Prince of Peace, I want for you to be able to say, hey, listen, actually this is good for you. If you're struggling and you're feeling a need for peace in your life, this is something that is good for you. Now, in two different verses, I've left my study notes at the back. Hold on. Thank you very much. So in two different verses, Jesus talks about himself. And I just want to point these two verses out. So the first one is in Luke. And in Luke chapter 2, verse 14, we hear the angels that are talking about who Jesus is going to be. And it says, as this is the angels talking, glory to God in the highest heaven and peace on earth to those whom God is pleased. So there's a promise that peace is coming. So for Jesus to embody this sense of peace is something which is actually worthwhile and we long for. And as we've discussed, even in our midst, there's many of you here who are longing for peace. in your own life, whether that's in your family, whether that's in a mental capacity, whether that's just like a sense of lack of hurry and rush. We long for an aspect of peace. Yet Jesus in Matthew chapter 10 makes a statement about himself in verse 34, which actually is something that seems to counter what I'm talking about. And so if you would, I love when the Bible throws us contradictions. So let's just take a moment just to look at this one. This is Jesus says, "Don't imagine that I came to bring peace to the earth," which is interesting because wasn't that what the angel said that actually Jesus was coming to do? Isn't that what Isaiah says that he's coming to do? And actually Jesus then goes on and said, "I came not to bring peace," like reiterate it twice, and then said, "but a sword." Okay, so let's just take a brief moment to look at this. John Wesley, who wrote many of the hymns that are still sung around the world today, in the late 1700s, he wrote this song that talked about Jesus being meek and mild. Okay, Jesus meek and mild. Well, he was talking about the baby, because I would imagine that all of you who've got babies would probably describe your baby at points in between the screaming and need for nappy changes, that when your child is asleep, meek and mild suits the baby well. Okay? However, that title seems to have been stuck to Jesus. And so as we've then walked forwards over the years, we would then refer to Jesus in adult form as being meek and mild. I'm going to point out just a couple of things that Jesus did that seems to jar, if you would, with the meek and mild. So the first one is that Jesus was very outspoken to the religious leaders of the time. So he was very ready to pull apart the religious leaders who were known for doing what they did. And Jesus, being Jesus, sees that instead of the people of Israel being welcomed in and witnessing and showing and being part of this loving relationship which God is calling us to, actually, instead, the religious leaders are making life so much harder. And so Jesus makes statements like, "You are like whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, dead on the inside." I'm sorry, if somebody said that to me, like, I'm not sure I'd be able to take that. I certainly wouldn't go, "Oh, bless you, thanks." No, I wouldn't, because that's rude. What Jesus says at that moment is rude, and he's saying it for a purpose, right? He calls them a brood of vipers at other points. Like, he's just kind of pointing out, like, this is Jesus. He's not scared of saying something slightly offensive, right? And then a little bit later on in Matthew chapter 21, there's a moment where Jesus walks into a part of the temple which is known as the court of the Gentiles. Now, what is the court of the Gentiles? Now, the temple is a place for the Jewish people to come to worship, but there are also non-Jewish people who worship God. So there is a court that is for them to be able to come into the temple and to be able to worship God. Now, if the Jewish people are doing their job properly, the Gentile court would be rammed full of people because the Jewish people are being the light that they were called to be. So Jesus walks into the court of the Gentiles, and what does he find? Well, we're told he finds a marketplace where there are people selling the items for the offerings. So instead of it being a place of worship, there's cattle, there's birds, there's people changing money, and Jesus walks in, and what does Jesus do? Well, I think in today's day and age, we'd expect Jesus to go in and go, "Guys, this is probably not the best thing to be doing. You know, let's go and have a chat. Let's talk about this silently. Let's maybe, what does Jesus do? It actually says Jesus walks in and he flips the tables. Okay? Jesus flips the tables, sending their change all over the floor, and then he picks up some cords off the floor and he winds them together to make a whip. Check this. And then starts like beating the people, saying, "Get out!" Right? Jesus, meek and mild. Not sure that title fits the adult Jesus. What we see is somebody who is deeply passionate. Why? He's not just like having a party where he's kicking stuff around and causing issues for the sake of it. He's doing it because he walks into a place which should be worship. And if the Jewish people were doing their job, it would be filled with people who loved God. And instead he walks in and he finds that it's exactly the opposite. So what am I saying? I'm saying that actually there is something about Jesus who is not afraid to say stuff if it's to prove a point. He's not afraid to fight in order to be able to see people come to worship God. You know, I always find it interesting that the United Nations Peace Corps, right? So the Peace Corps, which is therefore people who are supposed to be out there bringing peace. If you look at pictures of the United Nations Peace Corps, these are guys who are soldiers with guns, who are dressed in very different style camouflage, so it's blatantly obvious, but their job is to come and to bring peace. But quite often coming to bring peace means that actually they're walking into a situation which is volatile, and their job is to bring peace. And when I see Jesus, the not so meek and mild, when I see Jesus making statements about this, don't imagine that I came to bring peace, but to bring sword. There's a sense there which I actually hear. What Jesus is saying is that he's prepared to fight for you. He's prepared to step into your problems, and he's prepared to fight for you. This is the God that we worship, is somebody who loves you, and his love in action isn't to take the meek approach, but the love in action is to say, guys, I'm for you. And let's face it, if God is for us, then who can be against us? So if you're feeling in your life at the moment, over the past few years, we've talked about Jesus talked about our troubles in our lives of being storms. Okay? I think that's a helpful term. But sometimes we also need to acknowledge that actually some of the hardship that's going on in our lives feels more like a battle. It feels like a battle. Sometimes it feels like a battle. If you're struggling with depression, I tell you what, it feels like a battle to get up and get dressed in the morning, to get yourself out of bed. That's a battle. If you struggle with anxiety, it feels like a battle to be able to silence your thoughts. If you're struggling with family dynamics and stuff is kicking off at home, it feels like a battle. It doesn't feel like a storm. And we need to know Jesus, the Prince of Peace, to which we've been told, is Jesus who is not afraid to stand up for you, who's not afraid to go, listen, this isn't right, and I'm going to fight to make this come. So today I'm telling you this. Why? If you long to know peace in your life, invite Jesus into the midst of your battle, into the midst of your storm, and ask him to bring peace. I'm always struck by that moment where Jesus is in the middle of a lake and there's a storm kicking off and he's asleep in the boat while his disciples are freaking out going, we're going to die. And sometimes I feel like that. I know Jesus is in my midst, but I'm overwhelmed by all the stuff around me. And I feel like I'm going to die. Sometimes that's a bit extreme, but there's a sense of like, did you catch my drift? And they wake Jesus, and what does Jesus do? He says, oh, ye of little faith. And he stands up and says, be quiet. And the storm stops. And for me, I just need to remind myself that the Prince of Peace is prepared to step in and silence the storm. The Prince of Peace is prepared to stand up and fight for me. Guys, if you're struggling, and if you're feeling that life is just swallowing you, if it feels like you've got a lack of hope and a lack of peace, know that Jesus' plan wasn't just to come and it looks like failure as he dies on the cross, but actually that was the greatest victory he could have won. And he wants to step into your troubles and he wants to bring peace. This is the Jesus that we worship. We're going to pause for a moment. I'm going to invite the worship band to come up. These guys are going to lead us in our last of our songs. Let's just take a moment. The candles are lit. I invited you to do this last week. But guys, if you're feeling like, life is hard, if you're feeling that life is a struggle, and you're feeling that there's an absence of peace and hope in your life, I'm just going to invite you as we press pause just to focus upon the candles. Can I do this without accidentally blowing one out? Because that would defeat the object of this, wouldn't it? So I just want to invite you just to maybe just focus on the candle. Why? Because there's something about light in the darkness. And in a moment, I'm going to just turn the lights out and we're just going to leave the candles on. Murphy, could you just knock the lights off? So it's the two right-hand switches, the right and the left-hand switch, if you flick those two for us. So as we pause in this moment, yep, go for it. And then the other switch on the other side. Fabulous. It looks beautifully Christmassy, doesn't it, here? But let's just focus on the candles. And let's take this as a moment just to say, God, actually, as the candle emits light in the darkness, we recognize there's parts in our lives where actually we're feeling a little bit overwhelmed by the darkness. And we're just going to invite Jesus to bring that light that brings both hope and peace. So I'm going to leave a moment of silence, and I'm just going to invite you to invite God to be just that in your life. Then I'm going to pray, and I'm going to hand over, and Louise and the band are going to lead us in our last song. But let's just pause. Jesus, we recognize our need for you. In a world where life is hard, in a season where there's turmoil, Lord, we need you. We invite you to come into our lives afresh in this moment, to bring your hope, to bring your peace. Lord, for maybe those in our midst, Lord, who are yet to know you at all, Lord, would you reveal yourself, just like the candle is lit in this moment. Would you reveal yourself to us? We ask this in Jesus' name.